Reagan Breyer had always believed in measured living. Not modest, he didn't lack for anything, but measured, precise. His life was structured, deliberate, and cultivated with the same quiet focus that made him respected in his work and mostly left alone in his neighborhood. At 61, Reagan had the kind of face that seemed carved out of weathered conviction. Sharp lines, dark eyes that registered more than they revealed, and a voice like slow gravel. Even when calm, it settled in the air with finality. He wasn't particularly sociable, nor was he the type to isolate himself. He attended local board meetings when necessary, donated to the fire station's holiday drive every year, and nodded respectfully to every neighbor he passed during his early morning walks. But beyond that, Reagan lived in controlled solitude, and he liked it that way. His home was perched at the end of a gentle cul-de-sac in a suburban pocket of old-growth trees and meticulously spaced houses that had long ago priced out spontaneity and struggle. It wasn't flashy. Reagan didn't do flashy, but it was fortified, both literally and philosophically. Everything in that house had purpose. A reinforced door, not for show, but for security. Discreet cameras placed at deliberate angles, not to intimidate, but to document. And in the basement, locked behind a steel composite vault door, sat a safe lined with legal firearms, each one registered, maintained, and stored according to state and federal regulations. They weren't just weapons to Reagan, they were tools of instruction, precision instruments used to train others not in violence, but in responsibility. Because Reagan Breyer wasn't a collector. He was a licensed state firearms instructor with 20 years of accredited teaching behind him, contracts with the Department of Public Safety, and a spotless record. He had spent a lifetime teaching people how to avoid panic and prepare for danger without becoming part of it. And, ironically, danger never came from where people thought it would. For years, his presence in the neighborhood had gone unquestioned. The council didn't particularly like him. Reagan didn't smile for their potluck flyers or engage in the forced niceties of community email threads, but they didn't challenge him either. There was a quiet understanding. He wasn't trouble, unless you invited it. And that was the silent agreement until she arrived. Lorraine Duval wasn't elected as much as she absorbed power. She came onto the neighborhood council after an abrupt resignation, filled the vacuum with a kind of saccharine tyranny, and within 6 months had turned the previously disorganized group into something far more cohesive and far more dangerous. She was in her early 60s, heavy-set but quick on her feet when there was blood in the water, with an eye for order and a voice that toggled between condescending politeness and public scolding, depending on who stood in front of her. She had a background in private legal consulting, but spoke like a career school administrator. Someone who didn't just enforce the rules, but reshaped them around her comfort. Reagan could tell from the moment she took the chair at that first meeting that she wasn't just here to manage noise complaints and parking violations. She wanted control, and control required enemies. It started innocuously enough. Lorraine proposed curfews for landscaping equipment, then mandatory exterior light color compliance for aesthetic harmony. Then came the ban on street-side political signs, which was sold as a de-escalation measure after disagreement between neighbors during the last election cycle. Reagan didn't care about most of it. He wasn't here to pick fights over porch paint or tulip beds, but when she began pushing for a neighborhood risk assessment initiative, something shifted. The proposal was layered in vague terminology, mentions of security cohesion, resident integrity, and proactive compliance with safety ordinances. The language wasn't just ambiguous, it was surgical, and Reagan saw through it instantly. It wasn't about safety, it was about profiling, and someone like Lorraine didn't draft language like that without a target. 3 weeks later, during a scheduled community board meeting inside the high school auditorium, Lorraine made her first direct move. The room wasn't full. These meetings rarely were, but those who attended were the usual. Retired couples, a few nosy homeowners looking to feel involved, and Reagan, who preferred to sit in the back and leave once the vote was in. That night, midway through the agenda, Lorraine paused the meeting, cleared her throat with practiced ceremony, and shifted the topic. "It has come to our attention," she said, pausing just long enough to ensure everyone was listening, "that one of our residents is engaging in private weapons training sessions within a residential property." There was no mention of a name, but the pause after the statement told everyone what they needed to know. And in a neighborhood this curated, there was only one possible suspect. Reagan didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hand or respond. He simply folded his arms, listened, and waited. "Now, while there is technically no clause within our charter that prohibits legal firearm possession," she continued, "we believe it is in the interest of collective safety that such activities be disclosed and reviewed." That's when the subtlety ended and the insinuation began. Lorraine began speaking about community anxiety, about the growing concern regarding militant energy, about how a neighborhood should feel like a sanctuary, not a training ground. And with each statement, eyes turned toward the back of the room. Reagan sat still. When the meeting ended, he stood, walked to the front, and said just loud enough for her to hear, "If you have a problem, say it directly." Lorraine didn't flinch either. She simply smiled. "We're just trying to make everyone feel safe, Mr. Breyer. Surely you understand the importance of that." "I understand the difference between safety and control," he replied, "and I know the law. Do you?" That exchange would have been the end of it, had Lorraine been the type to settle for verbal sparring. But she wasn't. Within a week, Reagan received a letter from his home insurance provider stating that a third-party risk assessment had been requested for his property due to activity of concern. The request was unsigned, but the timing was no accident. He made 2 calls, one to the insurer who claimed they were following protocol, and one to his attorney who responded the way good attorneys do, with precise, silent aggression. A cease and desist letter was drafted the same day, referencing harassment, slander, and malicious interference with legal activity. But Reagan knew the damage wasn't legal. It was social. It was narrative. By the time the neighborhood bulletin went out at the end of the month, there were whispers. Conversations changed when he approached. One neighbor crossed the street without acknowledging him. Another removed her child from a shared front yard the moment Reagan emerged from his garage. He knew what Lorraine was doing. She was starving him out. She couldn't kick him out by force. His property was secure, his licenses airtight, his records unblemished, but she could turn the place against him, make him feel like a trespasser in his own home. And that wasn't just an attack. That was war. But Lorraine had made one mistake. She assumed Reagan was a man who lived off instinct, a relic, a stereotype, someone who could be baited into angry reaction and cornered by public sentiment. She didn't know he was trained to respond not with rage, but with protocol, that he didn't react. He processed. She didn't know she had just drawn federal eyes onto herself by crossing a boundary protected not by fences, but by law. And she was about to learn the difference between a citizen with a license and an instructor with jurisdiction. And Reagan? Reagan wasn't going anywhere. The morning after the bulletin, Reagan stepped outside to retrieve his mail and found a white envelope tucked sideways between the bills. No return address, no postage, just his name scrawled across the center in large, pressed ink like someone had been gripping the pen too hard. He turned it over with caution, feeling the thickness of the paper beneath his fingers. The flap wasn't sealed. That wasn't unusual, but the weight in his stomach told him this wasn't a message that needed glue to be threatening. He opened it slowly, slipped the single sheet from inside, and immediately recognized the picture before reading the words. It was a photograph, printed in color on glossy paper, taken from a distance with just enough zoom to feel deliberate. It showed Reagan stepping out of his garage, holding a soft rifle case in one hand and a training folder in the other. The image wasn't incriminating, nothing illegal, nothing even close, but it was intimate in a way that was meant to unsettle. It was a shot meant to say, "We're watching." Below the image, typed in a plain font, was a short message. "Concerned residents believe your activities may be putting the neighborhood at risk. We urge you to reconsider your behavior before formal actions must be taken." There was no signature, no council letterhead, no legalese, just that clinical phrasing, cold and non-committal. Reagan folded the paper in half once, then again, and set it on the kitchen counter beside the toaster. He didn't react outwardly. He didn't pace or curse or reach for the phone. Instead, he poured himself coffee, walked to the back deck, and sat in the morning sun, letting his thoughts settle the way he'd taught hundreds of students to do when facing escalation. This wasn't about firearms. It never had been. This was about power, the kind that feeds on perception, on narrative, on softly weaponized civility. Lorraine had started her campaign by whispering about fear, and now she was moving into the phase where fear was actively planted, then offered a solution. It was psychological, efficient, and deeply effective, unless someone knew exactly what she was doing. And Reagan did. By midday, he had already taken the first necessary steps, not reactionary ones, but foundational ones. He called his insurance provider again, requesting a detailed record of any third-party requests or changes made to his policy over the last 30 days. The agent hesitated at first, but after Reagan quoted the legal clause under the Consumer Rights Act regarding transparency and third-party disclosures, she relented. What he received in the follow-up email confirmed everything he suspected. 4 days earlier, a representative of the Neighborhood Risk Management Subcommittee had submitted a formal notification to the insurer claiming that Reagan's home may contain a substantial volume of unsecured firearms, along with an increased likelihood of negligent discharge. Both claims were baseless, demonstrably false, and carried the same name at the bottom, L. Duval. He read it twice, then saved a copy to 2 encrypted drives and printed a third for his attorney. Next came the municipal code office. Reagan had taught enough classes on state compliance to know the value of timing. He scheduled a voluntary home inspection, on his terms through the proper public agency, stating he wanted documentation confirming that his home's storage setup complied with local ordinance and state safety regulations. The inspector arrived 2 days later, clipboard in hand, and left after 45 minutes with a checklist full of clean boxes and a polite compliment. Honestly, this is textbook. I wish everyone treated their homes this seriously. Reagan nodded once and shook the man's hand. As he closed the door, he felt something close to vindication, but not quite. This was only stage 2. He knew how these patterns played out. The false reports wouldn't stop. They'd escalate now, morphing into more subtle forms. Suggestions of instability, rumors of erratic behavior, the kind of whisper campaign that couldn't be fought with affidavits. Which is why, when he returned from the grocery store the next evening and saw the chalk writing on his driveway, he wasn't surprised, but he was angry. The word was crude, barely legible, scrawled across the bottom of the slope where his driveway met the sidewalk. It read, "Gun Freak." The letters tilted and thick, like a child's handwriting done with adult malice. Reagan stood at the top of the driveway, plastic bags still hanging from his fingers, and stared at the word for a long moment before walking inside and setting the groceries down in the kitchen. Then, without speaking a word, he returned with his camera, took high-resolution photos from 3 angles, noted the date and time, and emailed the images to his lawyer with a brief message. Vandalism started. No damage to property yet. Preparing next step. By morning, a motion-sensitive camera was mounted above the mailbox. Not hidden, deliberately visible. The reaction came within 24 hours. A certified letter arrived from the neighborhood council requesting a formal review of Reagan's property under Article 7, Section 2, Harmonization Standards. According to the letter, his mailbox camera might constitute a violation of the visually conformity expectations for shared-facing fixtures. The letter wasn't accusatory. It was concerned, polite, almost apologetic in tone, but beneath the surface it was just another tool, an attempt to discourage, disarm, and delay. Reagan responded the same day. He submitted a counter-document noting that the mailbox, while public-facing, was fully on his property line, and that the camera was legally permissible under state law, with no recording access to any area beyond his private boundary. He included his legal counsel's signature at the bottom of the letter. The escalation paused, but only briefly. Later that week, a white SUV with tinted windows rolled past his home twice during the early morning hours. Not speeding, not stopping, just crawling, slow enough that the engine noise seemed more deliberate than mechanical. Reagan watched from his second-floor study, taking note of the vehicle's plates, its make, and the exact times of the passage. He didn't call the police. He didn't rush to post about it online. Instead, he added the notes to his file, cross-referenced the vehicle with public tag data, and submitted a quiet inquiry through an old contact in the Department of Motor Vehicles Compliance Bureau. He didn't expect anything illegal. He just wanted the pattern on record. The tension had settled like humidity, thick, invisible, clinging to everything. Reagan moved through his days with the same precision, but the atmosphere had shifted. The silence wasn't peace anymore. It was waiting. On Sunday afternoon, during a walk around the block, a man walking his dog paused as Reagan approached. The man nodded stiffly, then leaned in, lowering his voice. "I heard they're trying to get you removed," he said, eyes flicking toward the houses behind them. Reagan didn't stop walking. "They're saying you're a threat," the man continued. "Some kind of unstable instructor with military guns." Reagan exhaled quietly through his nose. "I'm a certified civilian trainer with legal licenses, 0 violations, and nothing on record," he replied calmly. The man nodded. "Yeah," he said. "But that's not what people remember when someone like Lorraine starts talking. You know how it works." Reagan did. That night, as he reviewed the digital archive he'd started weeks earlier, copies of every letter, every incident, every timestamp, he understood that this wasn't just about reputation anymore. It was about precedent. If they succeeded in making him the villain, they'd use it as a case study, a template. Someone else, quieter and less prepared, would be next. And the worst part? They'd do it legally, slowly, politely, and with just enough distance between intent and action to make anyone trying to resist seem paranoid. He closed the laptop, stood, and walked to the safe in the basement. Not to take anything out, but to check. To confirm, again, that everything was locked, registered, clean. Because Reagan wasn't preparing for violence. He was preparing for court. And war in a neighborhood like his didn't start with gunshots. It started with paperwork. By the following week, Reagan had stopped expecting quiet. There was no return to normal, not in a neighborhood where someone like Lorraine had tasted control and found it sweet. Control, after all, didn't require conflict. It only required momentum, and a community too distracted or indifferent to question the velocity. And that momentum was now building beneath his feet, pushing forward with the ease of something unchecked. On Monday morning, the first sign of formal aggression arrived in the form of an email, subject line, "Community inquiry regarding hazard potential." It wasn't sent directly to Reagan, but it reached him all the same, forwarded by a neighbor who wasn't friendly but wasn't spineless either. The email had been circulated through a private list managed by the council, asking for anonymous input about emerging safety concerns related to a resident known to handle high-powered weaponry. It didn't name him, but again, in a neighborhood. This curated, that wasn't necessary. The language was vague enough to avoid liability, but specific enough to invite speculation, and worst of all, participation. Reagan read it twice, then a third time. It was textbook inoculation, an accusation that didn't accuse, an implication wrapped in plausible deniability. And by seeking feedback rather than presenting evidence, Lorraine had shielded herself again. If challenged, she would simply say she was gauging sentiment, listening to constituents, fulfilling her obligation to transparency. But Reagan knew better. This wasn't transparency. This was triangulation. And the questions weren't intended to reveal the truth. They were meant to shape a narrative. He didn't reply. Not yet. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees and cast long shadows across his front yard, Reagan stepped outside and immediately noticed something wrong. The small sign he had installed near the porch, the one reading, Licensed Firearms Instructor, State Certified Safety Zone, was gone. Not damaged, not knocked over. Gone. Post and all. The patch of dirt where it had stood was smoothed over like someone had deliberately erased the impression. He looked around slowly, scanning the yards, the hedges, the sidewalk. Nothing. He went back inside, checked his camera footage from the past 24 hours, and found the gap almost immediately. Between 2:16 and 2:42 a.m., the camera feed cut to black, an override. Not a power failure, not weather interference. Someone had jammed the signal. The footage resumed like nothing had happened, the sign already missing. He sat at the desk for a long moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, then typed out a report and submitted it to his attorney. That night, he didn't sleep, not out of fear, out of calculation. This wasn't random vandalism anymore. This was targeted disruption. And whoever had pulled that sign hadn't just trespassed, they had neutralized his documentation, his primary line of passive defense. That required knowledge. That required planning. The next morning, things escalated further. A formal letter from the council arrived by certified mail, stamped with urgency. It opened with pleasantries, then quickly shifted into legalese. It has come to our attention through multiple community reports that your property may be in violation of Municipal Ordinance 12B concerning unauthorized signage and non-standardized instructional activity on residential grounds. It demanded immediate removal of any educational indicators, cessation of instructional gatherings, and declared that his continued activities could lead to a forced hearing under the Residential Conduct Policy, Section 14. Reagan read the letter in silence, then flipped it over to study the fine print. Nowhere did it reference state firearms law. Nowhere did it acknowledge federal statute. It was a letter built entirely on procedural noise. Layers of municipal rhetoric stacked high enough to look legitimate, but hollow at its core. Still, it was official, and that meant it required a response. He spent the rest of the day compiling a binder of every relevant law and code protecting his right to conduct training under a state-certified program. He included license documentation, public safety endorsements, liability coverage, and copies of previous inspections. That evening, he hand-delivered the binder to the council office, receipt signed and time-stamped. The receptionist, a young woman with the demeanor of someone who'd just started a temp job she didn't quite understand, looked nervous as she took the folder. Reagan offered her a thin smile, not warm, but not hostile either. She didn't return it. He left without saying a word. That same week, 2 council board members visited him unannounced. It was Thursday morning, just after 10, and Reagan had been working in the basement office when the chime sounded on the front door. He answered it expecting a package or a neighbor. Instead, he found a tall man in a pressed blue shirt and a woman in a gray pantsuit holding a leather folder. "Good morning, Mr. Breyer," the man said, extending a hand. "We're here on behalf of the council to follow up on recent neighborhood concerns. Mind if we come in for a moment?" Reagan didn't take the hand. "If this is official, you'll need to schedule through my attorney." The woman smiled politely, but her tone had edges. "We were hoping to resolve this without legal posturing." You're standing on private property. That's already legal. The man raised his hand slightly, mock surrender. Understood. Just trying to keep communication open. Reagan didn't respond. He waited. The woman adjusted the folder in her arms, glanced at her colleague, then said, "There's a growing consensus that your presence is disruptive, and some have suggested your setup might be in violation of public safety expectations." "Some," Reagan echoed flatly. "That's not a legal term." "It's a community term," she replied smoothly. "We're a community here, Mr. Breyer, and communities function best when everyone's aligned in values. I'm not here for values, I'm here for law." The woman's smile didn't falter, but it did grow colder. "Are you sure this is the tone you want to take? We're offering a path toward resolution." Reagan tilted his head slightly. "What resolution would that be?" "A reconsideration of your activities. Perhaps a commitment to cease instruction, or at least relocate it, just until things settle down." "I'm not a threat," he said, voice even. "You just want me to look like one." The man opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "We'll note your refusal." "You do that," Reagan said, and closed the door. 3 days later, anonymous flyers began appearing on porches in the surrounding blocks. They were cheap, photocopied sheets with bold type at the top. "Do you feel safe?" Underneath was a paragraph of vague but ominous warnings about an unnamed resident maintaining weapons-grade hardware and offering unsanctioned tactical instruction from his home. The sheet ended with a call to action. "Request a special council session today. Your voice matters." Reagan found 3 of them on his lawn. One was pinned to the base of his mailbox with a thumbtack. He took photos of each, bagged them in plastic, and added them to the archive. Then he drafted a letter, not to the council, but to the state's Department of Regulatory Oversight, outlining a timeline of events, including the increasingly hostile and defamatory tactics being used to discredit a legally operating instructor in good standing. He sent it certified with a return signature requested. By the end of that week, his insurance premium had increased by 17%, citing community environment reevaluation. That was the moment Reagan felt the shift in his chest. Not rage, not fear, but resolve. It had taken a full month of silence, of careful escalation, of war waged by implication. But now it was real. Now there were numbers attached. Now there was measurable harm. He began preparing not for a fight, but for a record, because when the time came, it wouldn't be about what he'd said or how he'd felt. It would be about what he could prove. He wasn't alone. He had the law. He had documentation. He had precedent. And above all, he had patience. Lorraine thought she was building a case. What she was really building was a file, and Reagan had just begun collecting. 2 weeks after the flyers began appearing, Reagan received a voicemail that finally cracked the careful theater of silence that had surrounded the neighborhood for over a month. The voice was unfamiliar, steady, low, and professionally neutral, but the message was unmistakable in its content. It informed him that a formal complaint had been filed through the County Board of Civic Conduct, listing him as a potential disruptor of community safety expectations, and naming his residence as a training site with unlicensed structural usage. The claim had been sent by the local council and now fell under a county-level review. This wasn't a neighbor's rumor. This wasn't a passive-aggressive memo tucked in a mailbox. This was a move with teeth, the kind that summoned actual inspectors, created official records, and forced public employees to knock on doors with clipboards and checklists. The voice concluded by asking him to be available on Thursday between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. for an initial assessment. Reagan stood motionless in his study as the voicemail ended. He didn't press replay. He didn't have to. He already knew the tone of a system that had been weaponized. It sounded courteous. It sounded like paperwork. But underneath, it was a blueprint for dismantling a person by process. Still, this was where the narrative always miscalculated. They expected retreat. They counted on outrage that turned sloppy, or resignation disguised as pragmatism. But Reagan hadn't been reacting emotionally, and he certainly hadn't been backing down. Every step taken against him had been logged, documented, and time-stamped. And now that the escalation had shifted into the administrative arena, he was ready. By Tuesday, his attorney had already prepared a formal response package addressed to the Civic Conduct Board, complete with notarized copies of his state-level certification as a firearms instructor, documentation of his liability coverage, letters from both the Department of Public Safety and the Office of Civil Training Programs confirming his legal right to provide instruction in private residence settings under state code, and a recent property inspection certifying his home was in full compliance with residential instructional limitations. The documents didn't just answer the complaint, they dismantled it preemptively. Still, Reagan didn't underestimate what the visit meant. County reviews were designed to seem impartial, but they were rarely neutral. Their power wasn't in punishment. It was in prolonging the disruption, in making the subject carry the weight of suspicion while others waited to see if smoke really meant fire. When Thursday arrived, Reagan was ready. He greeted the two representatives at his door with quiet professionalism. One was a man in his early 40s, polite but disengaged. The other, a woman, maybe 10 years younger, with a clipboard and a face that was unreadable by design. They made it 30 seconds past the pleasantries before the real purpose of the visit emerged. They weren't here to inspect. They were here to observe. The man asked about the structure of the home, how many rooms were in use, what equipment Reagan utilized for instruction. The woman asked about the duration of training sessions, whether participants carried firearms onto the property, whether there was any public signage encouraging people to attend. Reagan answered every question plainly and factually, offering no more than what was necessary but withholding nothing. He showed them the basement, immaculate, sparse, every component locked and cataloged, and pointed out the reinforced fireproof safe with dual combination access, bolted into the foundation. He showed them the printed class schedules, limited to one-on-one sessions no more than twice weekly, with no ammunition present during instruction. He even offered to let them speak to the regional compliance officer who had certified his home only weeks earlier. The man wrote nothing. The woman scribbled notes. Then they thanked him and left with the kind of expressions that said they would not be the ones making the decision. Reagan knew better than to ask what came next. The wheels had been set in motion far earlier than this visit, and whoever was pushing them wasn't working alone. The following Monday, as predicted, the next maneuver came not from the county, but from the council itself. A public email was circulated under the subject line, "Extraordinary Meeting Announcement," stating that a special session would be held to review matters relevant to community cohesion, comfort, and shared safety expectations. Again, no names. Again, no details. But everyone who received that message knew exactly who it was about. Reagan read the email, closed his laptop, and stared at the blank wall of his office for a long time. He didn't feel anger, not in the way most people would expect. What he felt was strategy calcifying. The lines were clearer now. They weren't trying to challenge his rights anymore. They were trying to exhaust him, break him down by repetition, by tedium, by making his life a constant cycle of justification, death by procedure. He had seen the tactic in bureaucratic systems before. He just never expected to experience it on the street where he lived. That night, he made his decision. He would attend the special session. Not to plead his case, not to argue or demand. He would sit. He would listen. He would observe with the same quiet, calculating attention he had given every step of this fight. And if they thought he would crack under the pressure of public shaming, they hadn't studied him closely enough. The auditorium was full, more than any meeting in the last 5 years. People who hadn't attended a single prior gathering now filed in with curious eyes and awkward smiles, their presence saying more than any comment ever could. Reagan arrived precisely on time and took a seat in the back row, arms crossed, eyes forward. Lorraine entered 5 minutes later, flanked by 2 other council members and wearing her usual armor of bland professionalism, a beige blazer, matching pearls, and a binder she clutched like a scepter. She called the meeting to order with a tone that tried to sound burdened, as if leadership had been thrust upon her against her will, rather than meticulously orchestrated. What followed was exactly what Reagan had expected. She presented vague findings about widespread discomfort, cited anonymous reports, and quoted community charter phrases out of context to make her points sound official. She stopped short of naming him, but her eyes wandered toward his seat just enough to signal her meaning. When she finally opened the floor for comments, no one stood at first. Then, an older man, Reagan's neighbor 2 doors down, shuffled forward and cleared his throat. "I've known the man in question for over a decade," he said slowly. "He's trained my son and my daughter-in-law. He's done so legally, responsibly, and quietly. If we start going after people for doing things by the book, what are we even protecting?" Silence followed his words. Lorraine did not reply. She simply nodded, thanked him, and moved on. 2 more people spoke. One cautiously critical, the other defensive. Then no one else stood. The meeting ended without resolution. No votes, no directives, just tension and exit. As Reagan stepped outside into the cool night air, he felt the weight of eyes again. Not hostile this time, not entirely, but watchful, measuring. People were still deciding whether he was a warning or an example, and Reagan had no intention of letting Lorraine decide that question for them. He walked home in silence, already thinking about what came next. Not defense, not reaction, preparation. Because the midpoint of every fight is not when the pressure peaks. It's when the masks come off. In the days following the special meeting, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted from suspicion to a strange kind of public courtesy. The way people behave when they know a storm is coming, but are unsure which way the wind will turn. People greeted Reagan with polite nods that were a little too quick, avoided conversations that used to happen casually at the mailbox, and refrained from even mentioning the meeting, as though pretending it hadn't occurred would somehow flatten the tension it had built. Lorraine, meanwhile, remained curiously absent from public view. No new memos, no forwarded complaints, no dramatic initiatives launched under the banner of safety. The silence was not relief. It was recoil. And Reagan, more than most, knew that recoil always preceded a harder impact. It came on a Tuesday, just before noon, when he opened his email to find a notification from the county building and zoning office. The subject line was simple: Notice of Proposed Safety Code Reassessment. The body of the message was written in the kind of official tone that disguised its intentions in layers of procedural politeness. It stated that, due to recent changes in the community risk profile, certain properties were now under review for potential building code inconsistencies, and Reagan's residents had been randomly selected for such reassessment. The scope of the review included not only structural aspects, but all modifications related to use of interior space for instructional or instructional-adjacent purposes. The language was crafted with exquisite ambiguity. It never used the words firearms, training, or weapons, but it clearly referred to his setup. Reagan closed the email, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. It was a brilliant move. The council, or someone aligned with it, had managed to nudge a different government agency into the equation, one whose jurisdiction wasn't legal or moral, but structural. They couldn't take away his license, and they couldn't win in court, but they could drown him in inspections, reclassifications, and potential violations that would drain his time, energy, and money. He responded immediately, forwarding the notice to his attorney, who returned a curt reply within the hour. "They're reaching, but if they push this through, We'll need to request administrative hearing protocol. I'll start drafting the counter notice." What disturbed Reagan more than the notice was the understanding that whoever initiated it had access to regional administrative systems. This wasn't just a group of neighbors whispering anymore. This was a network forming around a target, and the target was him. That same evening, he noticed a second SUV circling the block, this one different from the one before. No decals, no plates that registered in any public database. Just slow, deliberate movement past his property, cameras visible on the dashboard, a passenger who leaned slightly toward the window without ever making eye contact. Reagan didn't confront them. He didn't even walk to the door. He simply noted the make, model, and approximate time, filed the information, and copied it into his growing incident log. That file was now 83 pages long. Later that night, he received a text from someone he hadn't heard from in 6 years, Jared Stoneley, a retired compliance investigator with whom Reagan had co-instructed several state seminars in the early 2010s. The message was brief, just a screenshot of a thread from a closed online forum for municipal policy strategists. In the thread, a user under an alias had posted a summary of tactical options for reducing high-risk property activities, citing localized residential enforcement techniques and partnering with zoning review officers for unannounced evaluations. Reagan recognized the language. It mirrored almost word for word what was now happening around him. He called Jared the next morning. "This is coordinated," Jared said without preamble. "Somebody's been attending private roundtables, probably the kind run by firms that teach community associations how to control narratives. You've been marked as a liability." Reagan didn't ask how Jared knew. He just asked how deep it could go. "Depends who's behind it," Jared answered. "But if they've made contact with zoning, your name's in a database now. That's how it spreads. The goal isn't to win a case, it's to make your address radioactive." "What would you do?" Reagan asked. "I'd make it federal," Jared said, "before they bury you in local mud." And just like that, the next step became clear. Reagan began assembling a new dossier, not a defensive file, but an offensive one. He compiled every instance of harassment, every escalation, every non-transparent action taken under the guise of policy. He attached timelines, legal citations, certification references, and screenshots of every ambiguous threat veiled in bureaucratic courtesy. He didn't title the file Defense or Incident Report. He titled it Pattern. That weekend, he received an envelope on his porch. It wasn't mailed. It had been hand-delivered. Inside were 2 photographs, both grainy, taken at night. One showed his home, shot from an angle behind a bush near the side fence. The other was a zoomed-in frame of his front window, curtains drawn, but with the soft outline of a rifle case on the counter just visible beneath the silhouette of kitchen lighting. No note, no signature, just the photographs. Reagan didn't panic. He didn't even feel fear. He felt something colder, clarity. He walked calmly to the kitchen drawer, pulled out a black binder and removed a contact card he hadn't used in years. The embossed letters were faded, but still legible. Regional Bureau Liaison, Federal Oversight, Civil Rights Enforcement. That evening, he placed a call. It was not a desperate plea. It was a notice. By Monday, the response came. An agent returned his call and requested an in-person conversation. Informal, but off the record. Reagan agreed. They met in a parking lot of a quiet business park off Route 84. 2 cars parked side by side, windows down just enough to pass documents through. Reagan didn't speak emotionally. He spoke factually. He laid out the pattern. The agent didn't promise intervention. That's not how federal agents operate. What he did say, however, was more than Reagan expected. "We've seen this structure before," the agent said quietly. "It's not illegal to pressure someone with bureaucracy, but it can become illegal if it crosses into civil harassment, discrimination, or coordinated suppression of federally protected rights. "Is it there yet?" Reagan asked. "It's approaching," the agent said, "and if you keep documenting, we'll know exactly when it crosses that line." That night, Reagan returned home with a steadier breath than he'd had in weeks. Not because the threat was over, but because it had form now. He wasn't just fighting shadows. He was tracking them, and someone else was watching now, too. But Lorraine hadn't stopped. The next morning, a certified package arrived at Reagan's door. Inside was a legal brief filed with the county commissioner's office, a motion proposing an amendment to the neighborhood's governing charter that would restrict active weapons training within residential boundaries and prohibit storage of firearm-related instructional materials unless within commercial-zoned properties. The language was sly. It did not name Reagan. It did not retroactively ban him. But it was written with such precision, such surgical intent, that it was clearly crafted with only one person in mind. And if it passed, it would create a precedent others could replicate county-wide. Reagan stared at the printed words for a long time. He did not burn them. He did not tear them apart. He slid them into the pattern file and added a new tab. Attempted legal codification of personal retaliation. Then he opened a new document, titled it Statement for Hearing, and began writing. Because the second escalation wasn't about pushing him out anymore. It was about writing him out of the rules entirely. And Reagan had no intention of becoming a footnote. The hearing was scheduled for 8 a.m. on a Friday, held not in a courtroom, but in a repurposed civic hall with beige walls and metal chairs that made every movement echo. It wasn't a courtroom, but it might as well have been. The room was half full by the time Reagan arrived. Faces he recognized, some from years of neighborly distance, others from the more recent cold stares and hastily closed curtains. A few he hadn't seen before at all, likely there out of curiosity or loyalty to Lorraine, who sat at the front in her tailored beige blazer, flipping through papers with the deliberate posture of a person rehearsing authority. She didn't look at Reagan when he entered, but he could feel the charged stillness in the room shift as he walked toward his seat. Not because anyone expected him to speak, they expected him to defend. And defending, they assumed, would mean explaining, apologizing, justifying. What they didn't expect was what Reagan had actually come to do. The county moderator, a gray-haired woman with the tired professionalism of someone long past idealism, opened the session with a dry summary of the proposal, an amendment to neighborhood policy that would restrict instructional firearm activity residential zones and classify storage-related equipment as non-conforming material. The language was read aloud, slowly, each word carefully pronounced, but Reagan noticed how quickly the content passed through the air, how detached it all sounded, when spoken in the voice of bureaucracy. The proposal wasn't absurd on its face, that was its genius. It was carefully measured, carefully packaged, made to seem less like a restriction and more like a redefinition, a harmless pivot toward modern expectations. But Reagan understood what it really was, a personalized muzzle, disguised as neutral, reform. Lorraine was the first to present. She did so with the confidence of someone who had spent years mastering the performance of concern. She spoke of neighborhood values, of shared comfort, of the rising unease she claimed was palpable, since certain instructional activities had begun. She made no reference to Reagan by name, but her eyes swept the room in a way that made his presence the elephant in every sentence. She quoted emails, cited anonymous contributions, and referenced a prevailing trend toward residential demilitarization across suburban communities nationwide. It was masterful, hollow but masterful. When she finished, the moderator opened the floor. Reagan stood without ceremony. He didn't carry a binder. He didn't hold a stack of papers. He carried only a manila folder with a single statement inside. "My name is Reagan Breyer," he began, his voice firm but unhurried, cutting through the static of synthetic civility like gravel under tension. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 11 years. I pay taxes. I shovel my sidewalk. I wave to my neighbors. I also happen to hold a state certification as a firearms instructor with active contracts from the Department of Public Safety and a spotless compliance history. I don't run a business from my home. I run instruction, legally, quietly, within the bounds of every ordinance you've ever written or failed to update." He paused just long enough to let the weight of his words settle, then continued. "What you're reviewing today isn't a policy. It's a weapon. It was drafted in response to me, by individuals who've harassed me, surveilled my home, vandalized my property, and manipulated local agencies into opening unwarranted reviews. I've filed records, I've kept logs, and I've spoken with people whose titles outrank this entire room." He opened the folder and placed a printed photograph on the table in front of the moderator. It was one of the surveillance images left anonymously on his porch, time-stamped, geotagged, taken from behind his fence line. "This image," he said, "was left on my property in an unmarked envelope. The person who left it has not been identified, but the angle matches a known property registered to a member of the advisory committee. I've already submitted this to the Regional Civil Rights Liaison. What happens next is not up to me, but what happens in this room, today, will define whether you intend to function as a civic body or as a private tribunal." He stepped back. Silence bloomed across the floor like a slow fog. The moderator said nothing at first. Lorraine blinked, lips pressed in a careful line, flipping through her papers as if hoping they'd rearrange themselves into a better defense. A man in the back stood to speak but immediately changed his mind and sat down again. The balance of power in the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. What followed was a closed discussion between the board members, a low-voiced, barely audible exchange that felt less like debate and more like retreat. 10 minutes later, the moderator returned to the mic. "We are tabling this amendment pending further legal review," she said. "No decision will be made at this time." The session ended with the flat sound of folding chairs and relieved muttering. Lorraine stood slowly, packed her binder, and left without speaking to anyone. She did not look back. Reagan didn't gloat. He didn't smile or linger for validation. He left the building the same way he entered, measured, silent, unshaken. But the real shift came the next morning. A formal inquiry letter arrived from the Office of Civil Rights Oversight, requesting an interview with Reagan regarding targeted harassment based on lawful occupational conduct and potential coordinated efforts to suppress federally protected instructional rights. Attached was a copy of the complaint his liaison had forwarded after their meeting. The letter was short, but the final line was not ambiguous. The agency will determine whether formal investigation into the neighborhood council is warranted. For the first time in months, Reagan felt the weight in his chest shift. Not vanish, but reorient. He knew Lorraine wouldn't be arrested. He knew the council wouldn't dissolve in disgrace. But the paper trail was now alive, breathing with legal possibility and moving upward. His silence had been a strategy, not a retreat, and now it was no longer his burden to carry alone. Outside, the street was quiet. No SUVs, no slow drives, just birdsong and wind through trees. Reagan sipped his coffee on the porch, stared at the space where his instructional sign had once stood, and decided he wouldn't reinstall it. Not out of fear, out of closure. They knew who he was now. And, more importantly, so did the people watching them. Weeks passed without further contact from Lorraine. No emails, no motions, no sudden meetings or half-veiled memos. It wasn't defeat. People like her didn't announce surrender. They disappeared into the folds of policy, into sudden vacations and redrawn priorities, shifting their focus to other targets with fewer teeth. Reagan knew she hadn't changed, only recalibrated. But he also knew something else. The structure around her had changed, and so had the risk of pushing further. The council's tone had shifted entirely. Meetings resumed, minutes were recorded with new formality, and the quiet click of legal caution could be heard in every decision. A new vote was held to reassess board roles as part of a standard cycle procedure. Lorraine's name wasn't even on the ballot. No one said her removal was about him. No one had to. Reagan didn't celebrate. That wasn't who he was. Victory, if it could be called that, wasn't vindication. It was exhaustion. He spent the first few days after the final notice not filing appeals or preparing rebuttals, but trimming hedges, repairing a loose section of fence, and resealing the porch rail where winter had cracked the varnish. Normalcy wasn't an achievement. It was maintenance. And after everything, that's what he valued most: the ability to walk through his home, through his yard, through his life without looking over his shoulder for manufactured consequences. The file he had built, the binder marked Pattern, remained in his office drawer. Not locked away, not forgotten, but shelved with intention. The federal agency had not yet returned with a full ruling, but follow-up correspondence came confirming the complaint had merit and had moved to active preliminary review. Reagan didn't ask for updates. He knew the machine moved slowly, deliberately, and often without finality. But now it moved in the other direction. For once, he wasn't on the defensive end of the paperwork. Some neighbors returned to their old rhythms. Others remained cautious, unsure whether silence meant resolution or simply intermission. Reagan didn't press. He didn't seek apologies or approval. He nodded where he used to nod. He ignored what used to be hostile. When the older man 2 doors down stopped by with a toolbox and offered to help with a leaky pipe, no charge, just neighbor to neighbor. Reagan accepted the gesture with a firm handshake and no further conversation. Some things didn't need to be explained. The instructional sessions slowed, not from regulation or pressure, but from choice. Reagan kept his license active, kept his materials ready, but began turning down inquiries he would have once accepted. Not because of fear, because of clarity. He had proven what needed to be proven. His authority wasn't in the weapons or the paperwork. It was in how he had stood. He had chosen process over provocation, strategy over spectacle. He had taught by example. That, more than any certificate or courtroom, had left its mark. But the changes weren't just personal. Over the next month, the council revised several internal rules, quietly, modestly, without fanfare. Anonymous reporting forms were removed. External contractor communications were routed through county transparency logs. A new line item appeared in the annual report: resident rights and regulatory boundaries. Annual training pending. No one said why it was there. Reagan didn't ask, but the implication was clear. The structure had blinked. One afternoon in early spring, a letter arrived, not from an agency, not typed or certified. Handwritten, shaky in places, folded into thirds with no return address. Inside was a single line: "You didn't break. That's why we still live here." No signature, no demand, just an acknowledgement. Reagan read it once and placed it in the back of the binder. He spent that weekend restaining the deck, clearing brush along the edge of the property, reinforcing the perimeter lights before the next season of storms. It was quiet work, deliberate. His kind of peace. And when he stepped back onto the porch to look over the yard, he saw not a battlefield, not a victory, but a home. The sign didn't come back. He didn't need it anymore. They knew, and that was enough.